All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight in and laying out a roadmap to really understand the chaotic, frankly wild second half of the American Revolution. You know, we so often picture this history as a neat, straight line from rebellion straight to liberty. But the reality, well, it's a whole lot messier, way more chaotic, and honestly, a million times more fascinating.
So here's how we're breaking it down today. We've got 5 key chapters. 1. The turning tides. 2. A global war. 3. The overlooked revolutionary participants. 4. Treason and Southern strategy. And finally, 5. Victory and first president. Let's jump right into it.
Okay, picture this. It's the winter of 1776, and George Washington's army is desperate. I mean, morale had literally hit rock bottom. The British, they had basically settled into New Jersey and were just partying for the winter. Washington knew he needed a miracle. So what does he do? He makes this incredibly perilous crossing over the icy Delaware River on a blizzard-filled Christmas Eve. It was crazy, but it worked. They caught the Hessian mercenaries completely off guard at Trenton, making a massive statement. Then fast forward a bit to October 1777. The Americans secure a huge turning point by just obliterating British forces at Saratoga. That crucial momentum was exactly what Washington's army needed to survive, regroup, and retrain at Morristown the following winter.
Now that victory at Saratoga was a real game changer, because it proved to the world that the Americans could actually win, and that is what finally convinced the French to join the fight. But think about the incredible irony here for a second. You have an absolute monarchy, the French crown, helping a fledgling republic overthrow a king. The French king was basically sitting there wondering, could you imagine if your revolution inspired my people to revolt against me, and they imprisoned us and chopped all of our heads off? I mean, talk about some serious historical foreshadowing, right? Because the French Revolution was literally just a decade away.
So, this French alliance blows the conflict completely wide open. It wasn't just some localized rebellion anymore, it exploded into a full-blown global war. The French bring their desperately needed naval and land forces into the fray. By 1779, the Spanish officially join in, providing crucial support over in the Midwest and the Gulf Coast. The Dutch start throwing in aid too. And out on the water, you've got absolute wildcards like the Scottish-born John Paul Jones using downright pirate tactics. He's raiding British towns, capturing ships off the coast of Ireland. He even got the Dutch to officially log a U.S. flag design based entirely on Benjamin Franklin's verbal description just so he wouldn't be arrested as a pirate. The European powers were basically jumping at any opportunity to hoodwink the British.
Meanwhile, back on land, things were still really rough. The Continental Army was struggling with disease, starvation, and even mutiny during those brutal winters. But then, a Prussian baron, who was actually hired by Benjamin Franklin, shows up with a pretty simple pitch. Hey, I'm here to give your men a European military training. And wow, he absolutely did. He instilled strict discipline, he taught them how to shoot accurately, how to march in formation, and enforced serious camp hygiene. He basically transformed these guys from a ragtag, struggling militia into a formidable professional fighting force.
But right here is where we really need to pause and look at the bigger picture. Because as this war expanded across continents and oceans, we have to ask ourselves, who was caught in the crossfire? To truly understand this conflict, we've got to look at the devastating, on-the-ground reality for marginalized groups who were just trying to survive on the fringes of the revolution. Take a second to think about the number 40. It's a staggering, really heartbreaking figure in this context. It represents the more than 40 Iroquois villages that were entirely burned to the ground by a military expedition that was directly organized by George Washington in the summer of 1779.
The truth is, Native American involvement in this war was incredibly complex, and ultimately, it was tragic. Both the British and the Americans enlisted the help of various Native American tribes throughout the conflict. And sometimes these tribes were even explicitly pitted against one another. The end result for many, like those Iroquois whose homes were destroyed, was just absolute devastation. We're talking ruined homelands and a desperate, forced relocation to Canada just to try and find British protection.
And African Americans, both free and enslaved, faced these impossible choices during the war. The American Army actually stopped enlisting black men in 1775 specifically to appease the Southern colonies. And even when they were forced to reverse that policy later, many who fought for the U.S. were simply thrown back into slavery after the war ended. On the flip side, the British Army actively promised freedom to enslaved people who joined them. Now, statistically, you definitely stood a much better chance at freedom fighting for the crown, but even those veterans faced severe mistreatment and discrimination in their new lives post-war. So liberty was ultimately denied to them by both sides.
All of this reveals a deep, deep hypocrisy at the nation's founding.
Did you know Thomas Jefferson actually drafted a strong condemnation of slavery in the original Declaration of Independence? He did, but despite owning enslaved people himself, he removed that crucial text from the final draft entirely because he was terrified of offending the Southern colonies. The founders, including slave owners like Jefferson and Washington, ultimately prioritized political unity over the actual freedom of African Americans.
Shifting gears back to the military theater, a massive shock suddenly rattled the American leadership from the inside. You definitely know the name, Benedict Arnold. This guy went from being the absolute hero of Saratoga to the most infamous traitor in history. What happened? Well, after taking charge of Philadelphia and marrying into the elite, rumors started swirling about his pro-British sentiments. Washington ended up writing him a rebuking letter to appease the public. Feeling deeply slighted and unappreciated, Arnold asked to command the vital fort at West Point, but it was a setup. He secretly plotted to hand its defensive plans right over to the British. The plot was foiled at the last second, but Arnold managed to escape and actually went on to fight as a British general.
Meanwhile, down south, the British had shifted their entire strategy to focus on the economically rich southern colonies. American General Nathanael Greene knew he couldn't beat them in a traditional fight, so he had to really think outside the box. He came up with his brilliant, unconventional cat-and-mouse strategy. Step 1, he split his smaller army. Step 2, he led the heavier, much slower British army, commanded by Cornwallis, on a wild goose chase through the Carolinas, luring them further and further away from their supply lines. And finally, Step 3, he picked up reinforcements, turned right around, and faced a completely exhausted enemy.
This strategy forced Cornwallis into a desperate corner at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. The two sides clashed in this vicious, chaotic, close combat. Cornwallis was actually terrified he might lose the battle, so he makes an unbelievably brutal decision. He orders his heavy artillery to fire directly into the chaotic fighting, deliberately cutting down a huge number of his own men just to break up the melee. Now, technically, this gave Cornwallis the victory, on paper, but losing a quarter of his men in the process, that made it feel entirely like a devastating defeat.
Exhausted and completely running out of money, Cornwallis retreated to Yorktown, Virginia, hoping the Navy could resupply him. But the Americans and the French were ready to spring the ultimate trap. First, Washington fakes an attack on New York, completely distracting the British. Meanwhile, a massive French naval fleet successfully clears the Chesapeake Bay of British ships. Then, the combined French and American land forces secretly march down to Virginia and completely surround the city. Trapped, cut off, and facing relentless artillery, Cornwallis has literally no choice but to surrender over 7,000 troops. That was it. That was the crushing defeat that finally broke Parliament's will to keep fighting.
So, the fighting mostly stops, leading to the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which officially recognized U.S. independence. Following this absolute monumental achievement, George Washington said farewell to his men with a heartfelt message, hoping their future would be as prosperous as their service was honorable. You know, he genuinely just wanted to retire in peace to his farm at Mount Vernon. But, as we know, the new nation had other plans for him.
Washington ended up reluctantly taking office after what was essentially a massive grassroots campaign practically demanding that he lead. He had to invent the nation's highest office entirely from scratch, and in doing so, he established some massive precedents. For starters, he completely rejected royal titles, going with the incredibly modest title of president, like, the president of a local club. Recognizing he didn't know everything, he set up a cabinet of expert advisors. He started delivering an annual State of the Union to actually keep his own power in check. He maintained strict neutrality in foreign conflicts, and perhaps most importantly of all, he voluntarily stepped down after just 2 terms. He crafted a role that was powerful because of its limitations and respected for its humility.
And so, the United States was born with absolutely no problems whatsoever. Certainly nothing that would cause an extreme divide or, say, a massive civil war down the line, right? Well, obviously not. As we've seen clearly throughout this explainer, especially when you look at the broken promises and the devastating realities forced upon Native Americans and African Americans, the nation's birth was far from perfect. The compromises made back then, all for the sake of political unity, left explosive, unresolved issues woven right into the fabric of the country. Which really leaves us with a final provocative thought. Can a nation ever truly outrun the moral compromises made at its founding, or do those unpaid debts always, eventually come due? Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this fascinating history, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.